Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. This is part two of our podcast series with Charles Naud. Tell me about, because you've done some work on more cut down solutions. I mean, the software solution that you're responsible for can measure pretty much anything, and some clients use it in that way. But you've also provided some more cut down solutions in terms of the carbon calculator and also the diversity survey. Would you like to talk about those?
Yes, and this links back to a point I said earlier where I said, let's go back at some point to discuss for suppliers organization. This is the reporting that they might do for the work they specifically carry out for a client. So actually, this is something that I attribute to you, Sean. I learned this from you. It's thinking of a concept of supply versus supplier, right? And in reporting, you need to think about that concept as well. So what do we mean? We mean that what's important? Is it important that I purchase a shoe that is the shoe's recycled, etc., and it's got ethical standards for the product, the shoe that I buy, versus the entire organization that I buy from, right? So the organization might make a really nice, ethical, recycled shoe, environmentally friendly, everything that you want. It's all in that shoe, but the rest of the business is terrible, right? And I'm not saying that anyone is doing that, but it's just an example. So what's important? There's first of all that lens that you can apply to reporting. When you think about KPIs, key performance indicators, data points, etc., you can think, what lens should I take here? Is it important that apprentices work on my project, right? Apprentices from my supply chain work on my project. Or is it just important that I work with businesses that have apprentices and that have got a philosophy, around that, and that we align from that perspective? You can start considering that. And in a way, if it's not really a requirement for your specific project, it's just more about the supplier, go with that option because it's going to make everyone's life easier. It's going to give flexibility and so on. So if you're able to get away with that, again, I'm all about what can you get away with, then take that option. So that option being, let's call it a sustainable supplier, right? It's an organization with a program for apprentices overall, as opposed to sustainable supply. It's, they're supplying services to me with 2 full-time employees and one of them's an apprentice, right? Hopefully that distinction is clear. So with that in mind, what we're always seeking to do is, where are there opportunities for efficiency to make reporting as simple as possible for the supply chain? So we've been working since about 2020 with 4 of the major transport infrastructure clients in the UK, and together they've been working for longer as a group in trying to drive change around diversity in the transport sector. So essentially, how do you attract and retain a diverse employee base across all of transport and transport infrastructure in the UK? And so we've been working with them since about 2020 on helping them to do an annual diversity survey across their supply chain. And so we use a lot of the mechanisms that have been talked about before. But the key difference there, and it links back to the concept of supplier versus supply, is that we are helping organizations to measure diversity within their own businesses. And through that, or the way that we do that is having standardized the question set that these 4 clients ask their own supply chain. And we actually, we've set up a software for them where everyone does it, and it reports into a software, it streamlines the process, it enables to have scale. But really the key point that we believe is interesting and works well is that organizations are invited to a system where they get benefit because they're asked to complete a form, an annual survey around that's going to help them measure their own KPIs, their own key performance indicators on diversity across their own business. And then they can then simply say, well, I work for all of these clients, and the clients get access to that data. So the clients get an aggregated view of their supply chain, but the supplier gets an aggregated view of their own business. And then through that, we're able to create benchmarks and averages and so on and so forth, and give a view because we've standardized reporting across everyone. So those 4 transport clients, they've standardized the way that they collect diversity data across their supply chains. We're able to create a really big industry report, and that provides a benefit to absolutely everyone involved, not only the clients, but the supply chain organizations, the SMEs, because they know where they stand, and they can look at the reports and the benchmarks that we create and compare themselves to that. And it's just a really pragmatic, simple approach to getting reporting done. Through that, it's been about 6 years, I think, that we run this. On average, we typically get data covering about 500,000 employees across the protected characteristics in the UK. This is a UK example. Protected characteristics are things like female employees, percentage according to age groups, ethnic minority employees, and so on and so forth. So I know in some areas in the world you wouldn't be able to collect that information, but in the UK we can, and it just helps to drive insight into where the industry is failing or not able to retain certain groups of individuals, and therefore what can those 4 clients and then the entire sector do about it. But what's really, really pragmatic about this approach is that the 4 transport clients could have gone, we just care about the diversity of employees in our supply chain who specifically work for us, right? So I'm Transport for London. I'm working with some suppliers that are, could be quite large businesses that have got operations across the country, not just London. And Transport for London could have said, I just care about the employees that work in London, and that's it. That would have been a missed opportunity, because by collaborating with others and asking for supplier-wide data, you're benefiting the whole industry, you're benefiting the suppliers as entire organizations, not just a specific projects. And so that sort of driving change at a much larger level and bigger scale than doing it the opposite way. I hope that's clear. There's another example where we've done this as well. It's with carbon reporting. And carbon reporting is complex. I think I could talk a lot about carbon reporting and what needs to improve there. So I'll try and sort of focus on this specific point. We've developed a program again where we brought together main contractors, so construction businesses in the UK. We brought them together, and they said that they really had a handle on their own data when it comes to carbon. But when you measure carbon, you also want to understand carbon that's embedded in your supply chain. And so, without going into too many of the technicalities of carbon reporting, what we've created is a mechanism whereby we've launched a free carbon calculator for supply chain organizations working in construction and infrastructure in the UK. So essentially, we're allowing businesses to come to our system and measure their carbon footprint and get insights and action points against their own carbon footprint. And then very simply what they do is they then say, I work for these clients, and we have the clients provide their spend against each of those suppliers. And there's a matching and what's called an apportionment in carbon, the carbon accounting world. That's called an apportionment methodology. So if I'm a supplier and I do a turnover of 100 million pounds, and I have a carbon intensity of, let's say, 200 tons of carbon per £1 million of turnover, you can from that understand my full carbon footprint. My maths aren't quick enough, but you can understand my full carbon footprint from that. But importantly, if I'm a client and I say, well, I've spent 50 million pounds with you, then I know that I can then calculate how much carbon you represent for me as a supplier. And multiple clients can do that with the same supplier. So what we found historically is that client businesses looking to get carbon data from their suppliers have been doing sort of a one-to-one reporting. So I go to a supplier and I say, hey, how much fuel did you use on this project for me? And how far did you travel and how much energy and all of these things, right, to help calculate a carbon footprint. And we said, well, that's great, but it's not very pragmatic at scale, because if every supplier needs to report that data to every single client, we're going to be here next year still trying to measure last year's data, and then we'll have to move on to the next set of reporting before we've actually thought about carbon and about reducing emissions, which is the end goal, right? So again, try and get away with as much as possible. What the approach we've taken there is, as I described, it's just the supplier measures their full carbon footprint, and then the clients take like almost a sliver of that for their own data points. Now, of course, I'll caveat this with, carbon accounting is more complex than what I've sort of briefly described. And in some instances, what I've briefly described doesn't make sense. But in a lot of circumstances, it does make sense. And if you try and make sure that perfect is not the enemy of good, then it makes a lot of sense, this approach where you simplify reporting mechanisms for carbon. And you'll often find that you can do this for a real large chunk of your supply chain. You lose a little bit of precision as opposed to asking your suppliers for their exact data for work that they've done for you. You lose a little bit of precision, but you gain a whole lot in terms of effort and efficiency, and then you can focus on reducing carbon emissions. And so there's that benefit, right? I'm often having conversations with carbon experts and say, well, you can't do that because it's not as precise. Actually, we're not making this up. The Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol, which is sort of the rule book across the world for carbon reporting, says that this is a valid methodology, and we help our clients to apply that methodology where it makes sense, and where it doesn't make sense, we say complement it with potentially more precise data. Sometimes they complement it with less precise data. And for those of you that are familiar with carbon accounting, they complement it with what's known as spend-based. So it's estimating based on your spend in your supply chain, your carbon emissions. If I may just finish on that point, the sort of downside of using spend-based reporting is that even though it's very easy to know your spend and then just apply an estimate based on the sort of what, roughly speaking, that supplier does. So it's a catering supplier. Okay, well, I spend £500,000, X tons of carbon emissions. I can do those quick calculations. That's great. It doesn't engage the supply chain. So when you engage the supply chain, you get them to start thinking about carbon. When you get them to measure their own carbon footprint as a business through this mechanism that we've developed, you're getting organizations on that journey and you're helping educate them. And so then they're in a really strong position, and often we're finding that they're sort of really excited. And they go, wow, I know my carbon emissions now. I sort of know what I can go do about it, or they actually know what they can go do about it. And it helps them on that. And ultimately, the client benefits. If over time your supplier knows how to reduce their carbon emissions, thanks to reporting, then your carbon emissions are going to reduce over time as well, right? So it's just a win-win. So think pragmatically, practically, and try and find those shortcuts when you can. I'm always begging people to do that, and don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Take a rational approach. Is it worth improving the data quality by 5% if I still need to make 80% of the effort, right? No, just stick at 20% of the effort, have it 95% okay. It's going to give you a pretty good idea of where you stand, whether it's carbon, whether it's diversity, whether it's social value, whatever it is. And then use that data to inform you, collaborate and improve.
I think there's a really key point in there, Charles, in terms of the diversity survey and the carbon calculator. It's about collaboration. And you mentioned already, collecting data or managing performance through a single organisation is fine. But immediately you start to collaborate together, that multiplying effect. And, you mentioned 4 different transport infrastructure businesses in the UK working together to collect diversity data gives you 500,000 data points, which you would never, ever get as a single organization. So I think that whole message of collaboration is a really, really strong one. So thank you for that. We talked a lot, and I mean, interesting, you talked about spend-based carbon calculations, and I've been saying for years and years it's utterly meaningless and potentially counterproductive, because as you say, you get some data, you multiply it by a number that somebody's made up, you end up with a made up number. But to your point, you never ever engage your supplier in that conversation. So how are you ever going to improve anything by just throwing together some made up numbers? Sorry, being very controversial.
No. I mean, long term, I think you're correct. I would counter that spend-based analysis is important as a baseline, because if you think about, I've been saying prioritize, be pragmatic. Actually, spend-based helps you with that starting point to go, okay, this is where I need to be pragmatic, right? So using spend-based data, so estimations of carbon based on the categories of spend that I have, right? I could see, right, my hotspots are in materials and transport, right? You might say, well, that's going to be very obvious for businesses. Yeah, but you've got a little bit of data to back it up. Some spend-based analysis you can do very quickly, quick turnaround. It can be cheap.
Yeah, and also it provides some evidence, doesn't it? Particularly if you need to make a business case to your board to spend some money on carbon reporting, you can at least start to say, well, we've done this. This is where we think the hotspots are. We know the data is not very accurate, but we need to put some resources into getting a better solution. Yeah.
Into it, yes, that's correct. I mean, there's carbon in itself is really interesting, particularly when you look at the supply chain, because I think a lot of problems are amplified with carbon. A lot of reporting problems are amplified. I spoke about diversity. It's relatively hard to get diversity data wrong, right? Most businesses, they can give you, and I know this just applies to the UK again, and we've got a global audience, but in the UK, if you ask a business, what's the makeup of gender in your organization, most businesses can give you that quite easily. When you go to an organization in your supply chain and you ask them for data around fuel consumption or etc., what units is the data in? Do they have spend on fuel? Do they have fuel consumption? Do they have it broken down by different types of fuel? Do they actually have travel data, the mileage based on different vehicles and so on and so forth? And in carbon, all of those things can be used to calculate the same carbon point, and therefore if you think, at one company level, that's okay because you standardize the methodology. But when you're asking them from your supply chain, it becomes a little bit more complex, right? And it's not insurmountable. We that's my bread and butter, but it's a little bit more complex and it's a little bit more engaged and takes a little bit of thinking. And then also, with carbon, you then start applying conversion factors on all of this data to get from a unit of liters consumed to carbon. All of those steps sort of amplify the degree of where there's potential errors. So not that it necessarily matters, but it just shows that it's a little bit trickier, right? And it takes a little bit of thinking to do. And I come back to the same point. I'm sorry, it's I'm repeating myself, but at the end of the day, just be pragmatic. Just go ahead and do it. Yeah.
Charles, you've talked a lot about pragmatism, about efficiency, not collecting data that you don't need. It's really all about the performance. So you're actually collecting performance information and reporting in order to achieve an aim. All of that can be made a lot more efficient through automation. Would you like to talk about that?
It can, of course, in theory. In practice, our experience is somewhat different, and I dream of the moment we're in a world where you ask your suppliers for data around waste, let's say, and it's all tracked automatically through the waste contractors and so on and so forth. And actually, you're not really asking anything from your supply chain. You're just asking the waste contractors to provide that waste data as an example, and they have it logged in their own systems. They've got, smart scanners on sites, or, when they pick up waste, and and that all feeds back into a system, which through, systems speaking to one another through what's known as APIs, the data comes across into your world, into, your data lake, etc., where you want to analyze it. So there's actually everything that I've said around education, etc. It's almost not needed, right? It's just all automated. That would be great. So first of all, find opportunities to do that where possible. However, I would say just a few key things based on our experience is that, first of all, requirements, particularly at the beginning, change. So if you hard code something, if you build integrations, make sure that they're easily changeable, right? And I've seen a few instances of clients trying to, identifying opportunities to automate data collection from their supply chain, but then they're, and putting a lot of effort into those integrations, those technical integrations between two softwares speaking with one another and exchanging data. And then 6 months later, the requirements change, and so you need to unpick that work, etc. So it's just sort of think about it, do a cost benefit analysis, and also add the risk of change into it as well, because sustainability is not static. It evolves, and so just consider that as the first thing. So, however, what we found also is that lots of clients set out the objective of automating as much as possible, and then in reality, when you're dealing with a supply chain, everyone's using different systems in the supply chain. And actually, just right now, maybe this is the sectors that I work in, but right now what we're finding is that when you go down the tiers of a supply chain, or even the first layer of supply chain, tier one, then actually the reporting systems aren't there. And so there is no real opportunity to automate. And if there is, it's sort of in pockets of the supply chain, and one supplier will have one system and another system. So unfortunately, right now, where we see it is that automating the supply chain sustainability reporting is a little bit difficult, because the infrastructure is not there. People just aren't ready. So it might come over time. I hope it does. However, there's a key second point, which we've touched upon, that it's like spend-based on carbon accounting. If you automate reporting, you lose all the education and engagement opportunities, which sometimes is a benefit to automate, but sometimes actually a lot of the reporting as well is about creating that conversation. It's a nice excuse to talk about waste, carbon, diversity, whatever it is. And so, yeah, we just have to balance that out and think, well, is there not a whole purpose to the reporting that we would miss out on in a fully sort of automated world? We just have to consider that, and look at the maturity of your supply chain, or of different suppliers, on the various sustainability topics that you need data from them on, and maybe actually that's your real decision. Like, do I need to get them to report, because that's going to create a conversation and educate them, even though there is an opportunity potentially to streamline or to do this differently. Carbon and spend-based is an example. There are other issues with spend-based methodology for carbon, but it's an example of where you could do that, right? You could bypass the supply chain entirely and just look at your spend to estimate your carbon emissions in your supply chain. You're not engaging with suppliers.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, on one hand, I suppose it's sad, isn't it? Here we are in 2026, and technically we're not able to link up all this data. But as you say, also it does give you the opportunity to engage the supply chain, and ultimately that's what it's all about. It's not just about reporting for reporting's sake.
Yeah, I agree. I work with the supply chain sustainability school, and we really couple reporting with education. And we're seeing a lot of clients actually coming back to more, manual reporting and from the supply chain. And we've had a few clients on sort of missions to try and find opportunities to automate. So we don't want to engage on the manual reporting with the supply chain because it's too much effort. And actually, they're then coming back to us going, nah, we see the benefit because there's an education benefit, and we can see that we don't need to do it perfectly. We can do it in a really pragmatic way to make it easy for the supply chain and get us the data in an acceptable format to acceptable level of precision. And so linking all of that with education, it's quite interesting to see. And as you say, when I started off on this reporting journey 8 years ago, definitely thought that we'd be in a fully automated world right now, and we're so far from it.
So, Charles, thanks very much for sharing your 8 years of experience, and I'm sure there's an awful lot more in your head that we could explore. But I think our listeners will really appreciate that sort of pragmatic, down to earth. This is what it's really like, rather than a lot of theory that we see from certain quarters. So I'm sure our audience will really appreciate your advice and your insights into the whole world of sustainability performance reporting. Thanks very much.
Thanks for the opportunity. I hope it helps one person. That'd be great.
That'd be good. If it helps one, if it helps many, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.